These are a couple of examples of the scarves we're going to be making in class. This one I cut a short fringe on it, and this one was crocheted into a tube first, and then the fringe was added onto one of the edges. This one was knit on the circular Knit Quick knitting machine, and it was first knit into a tube, and this is a double thickness of fabric. And then I dropped every third stitch or so to make this decorative effect. You have to seam the ends of the tube and close it up into another circle here so that you can pass your fringe through. When you're measuring for the fringe, you need to go all the way around your neck and down the front of your body, and whatever number you come up with, you want to double that number, because the fringe is folded over and joined here on the edge. So just make it double the length. When you cut your fringe, cut it double the length of what you really want it to be. And I usually add a little bit extra so that when I get all the fringe on there, I can trim it off in a straight line. These are the two samples that I have here. The other sample that's at the church was done on a knitting loom like this, and it was knit into a rectangle and then formed into a little cuff to make the scarf. This is just a close-up of the ones that I had on the mannequin. And again, this one was crocheted in the round until I got it the height that I wanted, and then I cut my fringe. My preferred way of making these is, it doesn't matter whether you're going to knit it or crochet it or whatever, is to do a rectangle and then join the rectangle into a cuff. And I use a slip stitch to join that. So I'm going to demonstrate that really quickly. Okay, to do the slip stitch crochet, you're going to start with your last loop on the hook. So you have one loop, go through the back, and then pull that loop all the way through. So I've got one loop on my hook. I'm going to go through, just line that up, go through from the front all the way to the back, and I end up with 3 loops on my hook, and then go through. And just do this all the way down. And you don't have to do every stitch unless you want to, because we're going to be attaching our fringe on this end. Just do a neat seam all the way down, and each time I'm pulling that loop all the way through the 3 loops that are on the hook. And it makes a really nice edge to join your fringe to. So what I'd do at the end would be just cut my yarn and pull the tail through. I'm just going to cut that, pull it through, and then I'm going to weave that in real neatly and weave both of these tails in. And then I'm going to measure like I talked about my fringe, but I'm just going to cut a little short fringe here just to show how to do it. And then you would take your crochet hook and always poke it through in the same direction so the knot ends up in the same direction. So you'd pull that loop through. I folded my fringe in half, and then I pull both strands through. So let me see if I can do that a little bit slower. Okay, I've cut my fringe, fold it in half. I'm going to poke my hook in the same direction that I went before, so that these are my tails here. So this little knot right here ends up in the same direction. So I'm going to poke my crochet hook in the next place that I want the fringe to be. Anywhere is fine. Just be consistent. Pull that little loop through, And then you can use your fingers to pull those two tails through that and then just pull up. So you have your little knots all in the same direction. I don't think I mentioned before, but the chunky yarn is the best yarn to use for this kind of a project because the fringe ends up substantial instead of the little thin yarn. If you're going to use thinner yarn, you could braid the strands together or twist them together to make them thicker, or you can knit double-stranded. But this is the yarn that I used on the sample that we have at the church. I'm not going to use this yarn to show the cast on using this little loom because I think it would show up better with a thinner, smoother yarn. I'm going to show a couple of different cast ons if you're planning on using a loom like this to make your scarf. You don't really need a big loom. You can use any loom that has the number of pegs that you want. If I were using this really thick yarn, I would probably only do about 10 pegs. If you're using a thinner yarn, you might want to use 12 or more pegs. You just have to test and see what's going to give you the best results. But I am going to show how to knit a flat panel rectangle. This one was crocheted, and I'm going to show how to do a rectangle on the loom. So my preferred cast on is making a slip knot just like we did with the scrubby technique. And I take that slip knot and I pass it through the loom and anchor it on that peg and just tighten that up. And that's just going to give me a little tension against my yarn to help me to do the stitches. So it doesn't really matter which peg you start on because we're not using all the pegs on the loom. We're going to be working back and forth. So I like to come over a little bit to give me a little space there. And I'm going to call this my number 1 peg and my number 2 peg. So the beginning is the only thing that's a little bit different than the rest of it, but the technique is the same. So for the very first stitch, I'm going to come between 1 and 2 toward the front, and then I'm going to wrap twice. That's the only time you have to wrap twice. So I'm going to put my hook in just like I'm going to make a knit stitch, and I'm going to grab that loop that's on top or above, and I can either flip it over onto the next peg or just set it on there. Whatever way you decide, if you're going to flip it or if you're just going to set it on there, do it the same the rest of the time. So right now this is not correct. So to finish it, I need to pull this forward between the two and then back, and that cleans it up. So now this is my new number 1 and my new number 2. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to come forward between those two and back around peg number 1 and then knit. Oh, excuse me, no, I'm going to pull up a loop and then set it on that peg. I'm going to straighten that up, bring it back, and then forward between the old and the new. Reach up, grab a loop, set it on the next peg, straighten that out by bringing that forward and then back. Go between the old and the new and continue that. Pull up another loop, set it on the next new peg, straighten it out, back, and then forward. And do that for however many pegs you plan on knitting on. I'm just going to stop now. So now we're ready to start knitting back and forth. Okay, the second cast on is one I don't use very often, but it is a pretty cast on. And if you're more comfortable with a crochet hook, you can do this one rather than the last one that I showed you. And you just start with a slip knot on your crochet hook just like you're going to crochet, and you choose whatever peg is going to be your first peg, and you bring the yarn down between two of the pegs, and then you reach around and you pull up a loop between the next two pegs. Oops, the first one's always hard to grab. It's hard to get your tension. Sometimes I'll hold the loom up a little bit and just grab it and pull it through. And you need to keep some tension with your left hand or else you won't be able to do this. It's just like crocheting. So what we're going to be doing is crocheting around these pegs. We're not going to be flipping the loop on the peg like we did in the previous cast on until we get to the last peg. So I'm just going to reach through the next two pegs and grab a loop and pull it through the loop that's on my crochet hook. And I'm going to continue doing that. This cast on, I don't do it very often, so I'm a little awkward with it. But it does make a nice edge. So I think you get the picture. Now when you get to the last one, you just set it on the next peg. So you're going to get this crochet effect on your cast on edge. And then at this point you can begin to knit your scarf. And I'm going to go ahead and use this cast on for my example since I already have it cast on. Normally I would have more stitches cast on for this scarf because I think it needs to be a little bit wider, but for the example that's fine. Now on the edge stitches, we're going to slip the first stitch of every row, and that's hand knitting terms. It simply means skip this first stitch. Normally you would knit it, and we're not going to because it makes a nicer edge to the whether it's a scarf or anything you make, it always makes a nicer edge if you skip the first stitch of every row. It will get knitted when we come back, but it's going to be the first stitch when we're going in this direction. So I'm going to skip that first peg, and for this stitch we're not going to E-wrap like we did for the scrubby. I'm simply going to bring my yarn between the old and the new peg, and then I'm just going to make an exaggerated U. It looks like a U, and that gives me a little bit looser stitch than if I just laid my yarn across the front. This would be called a flat stitch where you just lift that over. This is called the U stitch because it looks like the letter U, and it makes a little bit looser stitch. So I just usually keep some tension with my left hand and lift that old stitch over. We'll do that all the way across the row till we get to the end. You're always coming between the old stitch and the new one. Alright, so now this one is going to be my number one peg going from right to left. So I'm going to skip this peg going back. I'm going to go between the new and the old peg and U-wrap. The U is going in the other direction now since we're changing direction. So you just stitch back and forth until you get your piece the size that you want it to be. In this case I'm making a rectangle. And I would probably make it about the same size as we did the crochet piece. So I'm going to knit 3 or 4 more rows so I can show you the bind off technique that I'm going to use for this project. Okay, we're going to just pretend like this is a big rectangle that we're finished with for our scarf. And you can see the edge because we slipped the first stitch of every row. You get this nice chain effect on the side edge when you slip that first stitch or skip it. So in either direction, it doesn't matter whether you're binding off from left to right or right to left. You have to start off with 2 knitted stitches. In hand knitting, it's the same thing. You have to knit 2 stitches to begin with. So I'm not going to skip the first peg because I think it would draw it in too much if I skipped it. So I'm going to go ahead and knit. And all I did was bring my yarn between an empty peg and the first peg, and then do my U-wrap or my U-stitch. And I'm just going to knit and knit. Now this is peg 1 and peg 2. Again, it's the same going from left to right or right to left. You'd just be counting from the other direction. Peg 1, peg 2. I'm going to take peg 2 and lift it up and put it on peg 1. Don't pull it up tight because you don't want that top edge to draw in too much. This type of bind off can pull in a little bit if you're not careful. So I've moved my second stitch that I knit. You can see where my yarn is coming off of. It's coming off of that stitch. That means I've already knit it. So now I need to bind off. So I'm going to bind off stitch number 1 by lifting it over stitch number 2. So let me go back and do that again. We knit peg 1, we put a knit stitch on peg 2. I'm taking peg 2 and putting it on peg 1, and then binding off peg 1, meaning I'm just going to drop that stitch over without wrapping again. Now I need to fill in the gap, so I'm going to move stitch 2 back where it came from. So now it becomes peg 1. So here's the little chant that I do when I'm doing the rest of the row. Here is where the yarn is coming off of. That means there's already a stitch there, and you can also see the 2 loops. So we don't knit that one again. We only did that at the beginning. I'm going to knit the second one by making my U-stitch, knit it, move it back, bind off, move it forward, knit peg 2, move it back. I'm not pulling that tight. Bind off, move it forward, knit peg 2, move it back, bind off, move it forward, knit peg 2, move it back, bind off, move it forward. And I'm just neating it up each time. I'm not pulling tight. Knit peg 2, move it back, bind off, and you don't have to move it because it's the last stitch. But this one has not bound off yet. It still has 2 loops on it. So we want to just add a stitch by just wrapping the peg and then dropping that over. And then now I can take this off. I can cut my main yarn and just pull it through and weave in those ends. So you get this little chain effect on the top edge. And it's sort of like the crochet rectangle that we did. We can now fold up our little cuff, seam that up, and add a fringe. So this would be like a little Barbie doll scarf, or just a doll because it's so tiny. But this was just a sample. So that's basically how you make these scarves, and the technique that you use to make your little cuff can be anything from fabric, crochet, knit, whatever, and then you just add attach your fringe to the side and then pass the fringe back through the hole. I just want to point out that if you plan on knitting a rectangle, the chunky yarn may not do this, but the nature of stockinette stitch, which this that we just finished is stockinette stitch, meaning the knit stitches are on the front and the purl bumps are on the back. In hand knitting, you would knit 1 row, purl 1 row, and all the knit stitches would be on one side and all the purl stitches would be on the other. But the tendency of stockinette knit is to curl on you. So you can see it a little bit better on this bigger piece that I was playing around with. It'll curl on you. And if that bothers you, you can add some crochet to the edge, but the easiest thing would be to take the knitted piece to your ironing board, and I usually lay it face down, and I just lightly pin the edges and blast it with some steam. Don't touch the iron to your knitted piece, just shoot some steam on it and let it sit till it's dry, and those edges will lay out really nicely, and then you can come back and seam your little cuff and finish your scarf. You don't want to handle it while the piece is wet or if the steam hasn't dried, because you could distort the fabric. So that would be my tip if you plan on doing the knitting on the little circular knitting machine or knitting by hand or on one of these looms.